Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming this evening. My name is Lindsay Ernst, and I'm an associate director here at the Center for Comparative and Public Law. It's my great pleasure tonight to be able to introduce Brian Dooley, and later take your questions for Brian after he's finished speaking with us. So Brian will speak for the first part of tonight, and then I will open it up for questions from you guys. Brian is the senior advisor at Human Rights First. And before that, he was working with many U.S., Irish, and international NGOs. So tonight he's going to share with us his experience and about commissions of inquiry into police behavior. And also later we'll raise some questions about discussing conflicts within social movements. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Let's get clapped before we even say anything. Thank you all very much for coming. And thank you very much, Lindsay, too, for allowing me to talk here. I want to talk about this tonight. All right. All right? Okay. I want to talk about this tonight because I came here around a month ago and I wrote a short report about the rule of law and what's happening in the context of the protests and the first demands. And when I went back to Washington and spoke to politicians there about what's happening and briefed them and their staffs on what they might do, one of the questions they had was, what do local people here, what do the protesters mean by an independent commission of inquiry? Because there's 100 different ways to have that. And is there a consensus here around what that should look like? So I asked some people here, and I so far haven't really found that there is a consensus, and I'm certainly not here to advise anybody on what an independent commission of inquiry should look like. But I have come across, through the course of my life, my work, a few examples, and I thought I'd come and share them tonight in case they're useful in terms of learning some of the elements of them if they're useful here. There isn't a formula for having a good commission of inquiry. I'm going to talk about 4 this evening, none of which worked brilliantly, all of which worked a little bit. And so my purpose here really is to try and at least give some historical examples to show some mistakes that were made and to highlight some of the good bits of each of these 4 examples. And mainly, I'm hoping that we can have a discussion at the end, prompted by what I'm saying. So the 4 I'm going to look at are these. They go back 50 years. The first one is the Kerner Commission into rioting in the United States. Rioting happened in the United States in 1967 across American cities, dozens and dozens of American cities. Rioted in 1967, mostly in reaction to bad policing, and a report was produced the following year. The Starling Inquiry of 1981 looked at a very specific incident which happened over a weekend in South London in April 1981, when, again, because of bad policing, local kids, teenagers, including myself, rioted for a weekend. And then there was an inquiry into that and recommendations made to the police. The third one is... Okay. The third one is a more complicated one. It's the Savile Inquiry into a very, very specific incident which happened in Northern Ireland in 1972, in one afternoon, when 28 peaceful protesters were shot by the army. Half of them were killed. And it took from 1972 until 2010 for the truth to come out. And the last one I'm going to look at is the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry, sometimes known by its initials, BICI, sometimes known by the international legal expert who chaired it, a guy called Sharif Bassiouni. And this was into disturbances, protests, riots, including a focus on bad police conduct in Bahrain, which is part of the Arab Spring, over a period of a few months. in the first half of 2011. I was researching human rights abuses in Bahrain at the time, and so I was pretty close to the workings of that report too. Okay, let's start with the Kerner Commission. No, let's not. Let's talk about, in each of those cases, I'm going to talk about the makeup of the commission, like who got to be commissioners, whether or not there was public trust in the process, how quickly the commission reported, and the outcomes of each of the commission's inquiry. Right? So let's start with the American example. In 1967, as I said, American cities exploded. Many of the inner cities were burnt to the ground. Newark, Detroit, Chicago, many of the other American cities. Mostly what were called race riots, where typically bad policing by white-led and white rank-and-file police officers led to conflicts with local African-American black youth. And the scale of this was huge, right? America at the time in 1967 was also fighting the Vietnam War. And there were times, for instance, the middle of July 1967, when the casualties, more people were killed in American inner cities in these riots than died in the Vietnam War. Hundreds of people over 1967 were killed in these riots, including some by the police. And so the President Johnson at the time, set up this commission to find out what happened and to make recommendations for what ought to happen in terms of reform. The commission was made up of all Americans. It was a national, right? They didn't think that they needed any international advice. Public trust in it was pretty high. Certainly the establishment thought that they would be more or less exonerated and that the blame would be put for the disturbances on the rioters, that these were basically criminals. And it was pretty quick. It was commissioned in the middle of 1967 and it reported at the end of February 1968. Now the outcomes were not as President Johnson and the government had hoped. The commissioners were mostly politicians. There was one person from a national civil rights organisation represented on it, and a few trade union leaders, but by and large this was the establishment. But it reported that actually it was white racism in the police that was the problem. It wasn't that the protesters were criminals, it wasn't that they were initially motivated by looting and stealing, that the problem here really was a structural one which sat within the police forces in these various cities. So the recommendations were really pretty good in terms of how to reform the police, how the police needed to police the cities differently. A lot of recommendations in the makeup of the police, meaning basically recruit more African Americans into the police force. And as a blueprint for radical, wholesale, large-scale reform across the country of the police, it was really very good. The President was really shocked by the outcome, didn't like it, didn't expect it. And it was one of the things which, in the weeks after the publication of the report, effectively pushed him to resign. So President Johnson, a few weeks after this was published, decided he wouldn't seek re-election at the end of 1968. So the recommendations were never really followed through. Now, over that generation, over that 50 years, there have absolutely been reform, good reform to the various American police forces, but not really because of the Kerner Commission. So I guess the quick lesson here is you can have a thorough investigation, you can have the truth be told, you can have good recommendations proposed, but it doesn't necessarily then in itself lead to reform. Okay. The next one we're going to look at is the Starling inquiry. So in 1981, in London, and in a very specific part of South London, right? So here we are, England. here we are, London. And here we are, this little piece of London, which is Lambeth, Brixton, right? And that's where I grew up and where I was in 1981. I was 18. And we were horribly policed. Police had this power called sus laws. Sus meaning suspect, which meant that teenagers could be stopped and searched very aggressively or humiliatingly by the police on the street. Sus meaning suspicion, just under suspicion that you might carry out a crime. You didn't have to be doing anything other than looking like a teenager. So we were badly policed, aggressively policed, and we were very angry. And on the night of April the 10th, which was a Friday night, there was an incident where the police tried to arrest someone, and things spiraled, and we spent the weekend rioting. And the country was sort of shocked, right? It's not the first time Britain had ever experienced riots, but the intensity over this weekend was amazing, and the footage on television and all the rest of it made it look very, very dramatic. So the government immediately set up a commission of inquiry, headed by a retired judge, Lord Scarman, very establishment committee, right? Everybody was British, again, no internationals were involved. And it reported, it found that over that weekend, 5,000 of us had rioted, nobody had died, there were 65 civilian casualties, 299 police casualties, and it proposed some pretty moderate reforms. It did not find that there were institutional problems really within the police. It suggested that basically the police were at fault, so we did feel some vindication. But really, it just advised the police to sort of be nicer, right? You don't really have to do this harsh policing of grabbing teenage kids, pushing them against the wall, stripping them semi-naked public and grabbing them and molesting them. Like, let's just stop that, right? And everything will calm down. So the public trust in it was, I would say, low to begin with, but the outcome was really pretty good. I mean, looking back now, it's pretty mild and moderate what they proposed in terms of reform. And yet, for us teenagers, it was sort of a validation that it wasn't all our fault, that really the police were officially now seen to have been in the wrong. And so some reforms, small stuff, was implemented. Like there was a new process now for police to complain, for people to complain against the police. And certainly we saw in the years afterwards a toning down of the really aggressive policing in South London. Now, it hasn't solved the problem. Brixton and the area, probably every 5 or 6 years since, has erupted in riots for various other reasons, including still policing problems. But it was better at the end than it had been before. Now, imagine, you're going to have to stretch your imaginations here, right? When we go on to the next inquiry, the Savile inquiry, into what happened in a small city in Northern Ireland in 1972. So here we have Britain. And here we have set up in the 1920s this weird country. Try and picture this. A weird country, semi-autonomous, sitting off the coast of a big power. It's allowed some degree of its own laws, but in the end, really, it's a puppet state of the big power. You might call this one country, two systems. So that was set up in the 1920s, and it didn't really work, right? The local government didn't really respect the rule of law. Its police were drawn from one sect of society. So by the 1960s, after this experiment had been going for about 40 years, people began in Northern Ireland to peacefully protest, to march for a series of rights, initially around fair allocation of housing, but then also around universal suffrage, because all those people here had votes, they were sort of fake votes that didn't really count. What? Right, oh, did I? All right, go back, right. So people here had votes, but sort of to a fake parliament, it didn't really matter. So part of the protest demands were around universal suffrage, and then as the protests grew bigger, the police started to use tear gas on them and started to attack them, and then part of the protests then became against police behaviour. The police tried to contain the protests for about a year, and by the end of that time they were really out of ideas of how to properly police the protests. They were starting to attack the protesters, law was breaking down, the police were at the end of their tether, angry, exhausted, unable really to police the community. And so, the big scary power, Britain, decided, all right, we've had enough of this, the local police can't control the situation, we're sending in our army. So Britain sent in its army to restore order in Northern Ireland, to police essentially these peaceful protests. So at one of these large peaceful protests in 1972, one Sunday afternoon in Derry, in 10 minutes, soldiers lost control of themselves and shot 28 people, shot 28 unarmed protesters in what is known as Bloody Sunday, which I assume some of you may know from the song, right? I can't believe the news today. Can't close my eyes and make it go away. How long must we sing this song? How long? Sunday, bloody Sunday. Sunday, bloody Sunday. Right. Oops. Wrong. All right. So, how long must we sing the song, right? So the incident happened in 1972, and we did not get the official truth admitted to or apologised until 2010.
Am I allowed to ask a question?
You are. Not a hard one.
Oh, no, very simple and quick. In 72, you said for 1 year they were peaceful. That means there was no vandalism?
No.
There was no...
No, the protest started really in 68, and the police tried to contain that and were given the opportunity to contain that by the British government. The local police were allowed to try and do that, and they failed until 69. So the army went in 1969, and then they tried to police it for the next 30 years and more or less failed. And a couple of years after they'd first gone in 72, January 72, is when Bloody Sunday happened.
Now this was like a Catholic thing at first and a Protestant,
well,
and it became the IRA?
Originally it was about disenfranchisement of mostly the Catholic population. Your vote depended on how much property you owned, right? Oh. So there wasn't necessarily all Catholics, although mostly because they were the poorer class. Their vote, they didn't really have a vote, or they were gerrymandered into districts, which meant that their vote didn't count as much as somebody else's. So the initial problems were around fair government housing allocation for like council houses, and really the root of that was around people having a vote that was really a meaningless fake vote. So Bloody Sunday happened, 28 people shot, half of them were killed. The government immediately set up an inquiry, immediately within days, called the Widgery Inquiry, the Widgery Commission, and it was dreadful. The Widgery Commission reported after 11 weeks. It was made up of Lord Widgery, a retired judge, and a few other establishment figures, all British. It took 11 weeks. Public trust, as in the Northern Ireland public, had no trust in this process, right? These were British people investigating British security forces. And true enough, they did a terrible job of telling the truth, in that they endorsed the lies told by the British Army, which were that the protesters had been armed and that the soldiers were acting in self-defence. That wasn't true, but that was the official version produced by the Witchery Commission. What had happened was soldiers had planted bombs and weapons on the unarmed protesters after they had been killed. Now, in the community in Northern Ireland, that was seen to have been untrue. The Civil Rights March was massive. I mean, there were tens of thousands of people there who witnessed really what happened. So although the official verdict, the official truth, was that the soldiers had been fired on and were responding in self-defence, that wasn't true. But it took from 1972 until 1998 for the families and the community in Northern Ireland to get another commission, a proper one, set up to rectify the lies of the first. I guess the lesson here is if you do a shitty commission first of all, you're going to end up doing a proper one that's going to be more expensive later on. So, the next commission, the good one that was set up in 1998, took 12 years to report, right? Because it had to be absolutely meticulous. And it was made up of 2 international judges, one from Canada and one from Australia, because public trust in the British establishment reinvestigating British forces was so low that the British government couldn't get away with that again. So it did take a very long time, and it was massively expensive. But it told the truth. In 2010, the Commission reported, and it said indeed none of these people had been armed, none of these people were posing any threat to any of the security forces, and they had all been shot, and that was all wrong. And the British government finally apologised. So that was good. But very late. Very, very late, right? How many years that is between 1972 and 2010. Some of the families and some of the survivors also hoped during all those years that they would be able to bring prosecutions against the people who had shot them or shot their loved ones. And that was always theoretically possible, but just a passage of time now, I mean that's almost 50 years later, right? Some of the soldiers who were responsible have died. The evidence has either been lost or destroyed. But this year, 2019, only 2019, which again is 9 years after the Commission produced the truth, a case has been brought and charges have been brought against one of the soldiers for murder and attempted murder. The soldiers in the report, to protect their identities, were known by letters of the alphabet, and so Soldier F is about to go on trial for murder and attempted murder back in 1972. So in terms of outcome, you know, eventually we got there, but justice delayed, justice denied, and it's a very unsatisfying end, even if Soldier F and there may be 1 or 2 other soldiers are eventually convicted. Right. Let's go on to the last example here. The Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry. So, here's the Middle East. Run by virtually everywhere some sort of dictatorship. Not everywhere, but virtually everywhere. And in 2011, some of these dictatorships became challenged by large-scale public protests. Tunisia, which is over here, managed to overthrow its long-term dictatorship. And then in February 2011, sorry, end of January 2011, Egypt managed to overthrow its 20-year dictatorship. And various other countries in the region then went into this mass protest mode, trying to get rid of their dictators, including the smallest country in the Middle East, Bahrain, right? I mean, it's so titchy there that you can, like, it's so titchy there that you can barely see it, right? There it is, right? It's tiny. About 1.5 million people live there. About half of those are expats. It's a sort of a financial centre. I mean, it's a main industry. It doesn't really have its own oil. Again, imagine a scenario where you have a small country, an island really, off the coast of a massively scary, repressive power, Saudi Arabia, one of the most powerful economies, one of the most repressive regimes in the world. And up until 2011, Bahrain was a sort of an oasis of relative political and social liberalism, right? Compared to Saudi Arabia, certainly. Saudi Arabia is so socially conservative, women couldn't drive, cinemas were not allowed, alcohol wasn't allowed to be sold, women could not go anywhere without the permission of a male relative. Bahrain, not as bad, right? It had all that social freedom to some extent. It even allowed a sort of an independent opposition newspaper to exist. It sort of allowed opposition political groups to exist, and even allowed people, again, to vote for a fake parliament, right? So try and imagine that, right? You've got a big, scary, repressive power and a relatively liberal, politically open society just off its coast. Only really being allowed to operate within the limits set by Saudi Arabia. So in February of 2011, inspired by what happened in Tunisia and Egypt, tens of thousands of people, remember there's only 1.5 million people in the country to begin with, and half of those are foreigners, but tens of thousands of people started mass peaceful protests, first of all for reform, but then ultimately to overthrow the dictatorship in Bahrain. So Saudi Arabia watched this happen for a few weeks. And the Bahrain police tried to contain these peaceful protests using an awful lot of tear gas. Incredibly, tear gas produced in the US, produced in Pennsylvania, produced in Salzburg, exactly the same place that your police have been using it against protesters here. So this went on for 4 weeks, and Saudi sort of tolerated it, gave the local Bahraini authorities the space, the opportunity to try to contain what was happening, and after 4 weeks, its patience ran out. And the Saudi army invaded and crushed the protesters. Killed a few dozen people, arrested thousands of people, tortured hundreds of people. So during that time, during the crackdown, international NGOs, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, Physicians for Human Rights, myself for Human Rights Watch were in Bahrain witnessing and recording and documenting the abuses. And the Bahraini government said we were exaggerating or fabricating or just lying, making the stuff up. So in response to international pressure then, the Bahraini government set up its commission of inquiry into what had happened, particularly around how its police and the Saudi forces, which were backing the police, had crushed the protests. It was made up of all internationals, right? There were 6 commissioners, and none of them were Bahraini. To give any sort of public credibility into the process, it needed to be international commissioners, and it was led, as I mentioned before, by an Egyptian legal academic, Sharif Bassiouni. The next in charge was a long-term British academic, Nigel Rodley. These were big deal, respected international legal figures. The government paid for the commission, and I think fully expected to be exonerated. And it wasn't. Public trust in the commission began as very low. I was very sceptical of it. I was sort of an international critic, expert, saying, you know, I don't really think this is going to work. Like, how independent can it be when the government has appointed it and the government has paid for it and it's reporting back to the government? But actually, they did a really pretty good job. They vindicated what we had been saying, that in February, really March, April of 2011, hundreds of people have been tortured. Some have been tortured to death in custody by the police. A couple of dozen people have been killed. And the government basically were in the wrong. And the King of Bahrain thought that this would be like a great open PR move to have this commission of inquiry which was going to exonerate his government and his security forces, and so he gathered us all, thousands of us, I mean literally thousands, in the biggest room you've ever seen in your life in one of his palaces, right? And the commission then reported on their findings, and he was sitting there, and the commissioner saying, yeah, I'm afraid that your police force killed 36 people, 5 of them tortured to death in custody, everything that the international press and international human rights organisations have been saying that you denied is true. Super awkward, right? And great. So the king said, okay, you know, if that's true, then that's true, and I'm really shocked, and I'm sorry, and blah, 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 and I will implement the dozens of recommendations that you're making that we need to change here, particularly around the police, the makeup of the police, and that they were drawn really from the minority Sunni sect, no representation of the majority Shia public, that we're going to stop torturing people, that we're going to release all the political prisoners, we're going to do everything that the report says we ought to do. And they didn't do any of it. They didn't do any of it. So the report worked pretty well as far as telling the truth, exposing to the world really what happened, and making really good recommendations for what needed to happen. But it couldn't really enforce those recommendations. It couldn't make the government listen to it and introduce the reforms. So nothing much has changed in terms of the police, and no one has been tortured to death in custody for some years, but at really the behest of big scary neighbouring power Saudi, all the opposition is now gone. The newspaper has been closed down, the opposition groups, parties have been shut down. Anybody who's a dissident is now either forced into exile or in prison. And that sort of little experiment of let's see what happens if we allow Bahrain a bit of democracy, not quite a one country, two system, but pretty close. If we allow this little island kingdom off our shore to play about a little bit with political and social liberalisation, I think the lesson that the Saudis think they've learned is that this doesn't work, and we're just going to crush it. So things are now quite a lot worse than they were in Bahrain like 10 years ago. I think that's more or less going to finish there. I mean, the point here is not to say, you know, these are one of the models which are right for Hong Kong, or that, you know, these are the models that any commission of inquiry anywhere in the world ought to be based on. But in terms of, if we can try and pull out the good things from them, ones which report relatively fast, as in a matter of months rather than 38 years, are good. Ones which have public trust clearly are good, but there's different ways of doing that, right? In the Kerner Commission, it was all Americans, and that was fine. In the Starling inquiry, it was all British, and that was fine. In the Bloody Sunday inquiry, originally it was all British, and that wasn't fine, so they had to go exclusively international. And in the Bahrain Commission, then they had to go exclusively international. So again, it's not like there's one answer, right? But for different cultures, different contexts, internationals might work. And then there's the recommendation bit. Some of these inquiries really just were out to tell the truth of what had happened. Others of them, like the Kerner Commissions, others of them tried to tell the truth and then open the way for future prosecutions against the army or the police. And then the really difficult bit, particularly with the first one, the Kerner Commission and the Bahrain Commission, both of which really told in very comprehensive, huge reports the truth of what had happened and made really good recommendations, but they didn't really have any muscle, any power to make sure that they were seen through. Okay, I'm going to stop now, and if people have questions, fine. If not, I'm going to subject you to me talking about something a bit different.
Great, thank you, Brian. Any questions?
quiet. Since there is nobody asking questions, let me have a shot. Have you looked at some of the Hong Kong commissions of inquiries? Because we've had quite a few of them in the past decades, whether it be Vietnamese refugees or marine disaster, and so on and so forth, with the commissioners, so to speak, having the right to subpoena and ask for evidence. So have you had a look at those, and how do they compare to what you've got here?
Brian, I'm going to take one more question.
Yes,
Just get two
please,
questions,
yeah,
and then because I saw your hand raised it.
Thank you. I'm wondering why the Kerner Commission's report wasn't implemented. It seems that all the right criteria were there, and there wasn't. It wasn't like the Bahrain case, where you have a powerful neighbor intervening in the progress and implementation of the report.
Yeah.
It was in the United States. So what are the factors that affect potential implementation?
Okay. So on the first one, my answer is a little bit, in that I have seen and looked at previous Hong Kong commissions of inquiry, and as I understand it, they've more or less had public trust, and they have more or less, I think all of them have been conducted by local experts. That there haven't been, commissioners haven't been headed by somebody from...
Except for one that I remember.
And where was that from?
I mean, you're right in the sense that these have all been local experts and generally judges, judiciary,
right.
and generally they are well regarded in terms of the people and the results. But I do recall another inquiry which was post-1970s.
All right.
I'm that old.
Yeah, me too.
I think it was after the storming of the ICEC by the Hong Kong police.
Okay.
And I think the Hong Kong government then brought out 3 experts from the United Kingdom to look at the system of policing and the organization of police and the culture and so on and so forth. And I don't know, I don't remember whether that was called a commission of inquiry or whether it was a review.
Okay.
Yeah, so that one I do remember. It was from overseas.
So I guess I certainly don't want to give the impression that it can only work if you have internationals. That makes it more independent. I don't think that's true. And if what works in this context or another context is for the commission to have the powers and the personnel which more or less the public trust, then that's all you need. It doesn't matter if they're local or not. And in terms of the powers of subpoena, again, it's what will have credibility locally, and whether or not the aim is to just tell the truth, or the aim is to tell the truth with a view to accountability and prosecutions. But as I understand it, until now, apart from that one exception then, the public has more or less trusted these commissions of inquiry to be independent and credible without having to go outside of Hong Kong for legal expertise. In terms of the Kerner Commission, it was really I don't think there was anything particularly sort of sinister or conspiratorial about why it wasn't enacted, or why the recommendations weren't enacted. The heat was taken out, at least temporarily, of the issue in that 1968, the year after 1967, when the riots happened, wasn't quite as bad. Martin Luther King was assassinated about a month after the report came out, which then did trigger a huge, again, a temporary eruption of violence across American cities, but then that died down a little bit. Mostly it was that the President Johnson, who commissioned it, then was disappointed in his findings, pressure on him because of the bad way the Vietnam War was going, and it looked like he had lost control of what was called race relations in those days, and various other factors led him to resign. And then the election that year was won by the opposition Republican Party, Nixon, who thought that these recommendations were too liberal and soft, and what was needed was a restoration of law and order. Although, in fairness to the commission too, there were 11 commissioners, and it was pretty bipartisan. The chair of it, Kerner, was a Democrat, but the vice chair was the New York mayor, John Lindsay, a Republican. And so again, it sort of had broad national support, I guess, but it was more of why the recommendations weren't implemented really were a function of just the change in government over that next year, although those issues didn't go away. And in fact, many of the recommendations were subsequently introduced, for slow learners over the years, but really could have been introduced much faster and better.
As an American, I want to talk about the 60s situation. Watts riots in 1965, I grew up in LA. It wasn't too far from where I grew up. And this kind of set the stage for it, I think. And I see it mostly as being economic, though later on it became an anti-Vietnam War protester. But if you look at all those riots, they were mostly like black riots. And if you look at the government's response over the next 10 to 15 years, the number of incarceration, and especially black incarceration, really skyrocketed. And so that was the government's response. We'll just get all these people locked up.
And that didn't really work long term either. I mean, you're right, there'd been the Watts riot in 64, Harlem in 65, Harlem in 64, and for decades before that. I mean, 67 wasn't the first time that there were riots in American cities, but the scale of it was colossal. And it didn't just look at the behaviour of the police, although that was really the main focus of it, because it found in every instance the riot had been triggered, in all of these dozens of American cities, had been triggered by some altercation between young, usually black, but young people and some representative of the local authority, usually the police, sometimes the local politician. But it also,
in the Watts riots, it was actually a traffic stop.
Right.
That was kind of funny at first, but then it kind of got out of hand.
And when we rioted in Brixton, it was over the failure of the police to handle a very small incident outside a youth club, and then a group gathered, and a bigger group gathered, and then more police gathered, and it just took off. The Kerner Commission is really a book. I mean, literally, it's like a huge, a large-sized book which covers all sorts of things, including police behaviour, but also how the disturbances, the riots, were covered by the press. This was 67. The rate of colour televisions in America had doubled in the previous, ownership of a colour television had doubled in the previous 3 years, and there were graphic, shocking pictures now showing the rest of America what was happening in the inner cities. And a lot of the focus too was on how the press should responsibly, accurately cover disturbances and riots. And again, I don't think there's any one answer to that either, and you still see that here too.
One more thing I want to add, and that is the way the police handle things in America. It's like shoot first and then worry about what to do later. And it still goes on today in how they handle black situations.
I mean, clearly the US has a huge policing problem still. One thing it has done, one thing it's improved on over the last 50 years is the recruitment of its personnel. So it's much more diverse now. You have many more black police personnel, many more Latino police personnel than you did then, and that helps. But again, structurally, clearly there are massive problems.
I have two questions. So the Kerner Commission, as I understand it, implicated not just white supremacy within the police force, but really white supremacy in American society as a whole. But it sounds like with the civilian inquiry, justice and was sort of dealt out on more of an individual level. So my question is, how do these commissions decide sort of the scope of what and who they implicate?
So in those examples, there's two ways that happens, right? There's like the official remit. Here's what you're supposed to look at, which I have to say is usually healthily ignored, right? Once they get into it, they sort of disregard the limits. So the Kerner Commission did identify white racism, as it called it, as a real problem. At Scarman, the Brixton inquiry, the South London inquiry, it didn't cop out completely and say it's just a few bad apples. It wasn't quite that. But it didn't tell the full truth, which was there is a structural institutional problem here. And that didn't really come out for another 15, 20 years, when there was an independent police inquiry into the London police, again, not over protests or over riots, but over the murder of one black teenager, Stephen Lawrence. And the police mishandled that case so badly and failed to bring convictions in that case. The public outcry was so loud at that it had to set up an inquiry into where the police had gone wrong. And the first inquiry found that the police had gone wrong because of institutional racism. So it said some of the things that the Scarman inquiry 15, 20 years later failed to say and should have said. But as I say, at the time, we felt partially vindicated. I mean, us kids felt partially vindicated. We thought this, this old establishment judge guy was clearly just going to be on the police's side and say we were wrong, and he didn't say that, in fairness to him.
Do you know of any instances where the government is forced to appoint a commission of inquiry under pressure, but then try to play games in the terms of references, so that the commission is just a toothless tiger?
Let me talk about Bahrain again, because I think the Bahraini government played it more clever than that, in that they were forced to appoint a commission of inquiry, and then they said, you can say and do what you want. The commissioners had great access to interview any member of the police they wanted. They had access, which we didn't have, to political prisoners in prison. They took 9,000 testimonies over the course of that 6 months, right? So they weren't limited. I mean, the government managed to control what happened, not by limiting the terms of the inquiry, but by just ignoring its findings, I think, which is a far cleverer and more effective way of doing it. In terms of where the government sets up an inquiry and then tries to hide the truth, I think that's what happened in the first version of the Bloody Sunday inquiry, where those 28 people had been shot. The government immediately set up an inquiry and clearly loaded it so that it just heard from witnesses who were going to really corroborate its story, and those witnesses it brought in who didn't corroborate its story, it ignored. But almost immediately, that was seen to have been fake. Journalists started picking holes in the report, and it took a long time for us to set it right. But that didn't really work in terms of setting up a pretend one. The government were found out sort of straight away then.
In the context of like a big brother next door.
Oh yeah.
Looking at the Savile and the Bahraini Commission reports, did they kind of try and tease out the difference between the local police actions and then the army from the neighbour that came in, and how was there any pretense in trying to separate or work that out, and how those recommendations were?
Yes, there was, and in both cases, really, they came to, I think, the correct conclusion that the local police just were overwhelmed and couldn't cope. This is not what they've been trained for. This is not what they had sufficient numbers and personnel to not contain, but to police professionally. And bringing in the outside invasion force wasn't like a good thing. That ended up just exacerbating the situation, and people ended up being killed. So there was a difference there. I mean, not exactly sympathetic to the local police, but some degree of mitigation there that, you know, the local police force wasn't recruited or trained or really intended to be able to deal with this large scale, huge industrial scale protests. And in both cases, the police were given months. In the case of Northern Ireland, sort of a year. In the case of Bahrain, well, really only a month to try and sort it out. And when it became apparent that the police were losing, then the army came in.
Come to you, Peter, in 1 minute, and I'll have one question here then.
I was just wondering, in the case of Bahrain, you said that the government allowed the commission to interview anyone that they wanted to, but is it known if there was any adverse consequences for those people who did go to the interviews in aftermath?
Ah, good question. I'd say no. Some of the leading political dissidents were interviewed and gave full testimony about how they'd been tortured and were still in prison and are still in prison. But I don't think that they have been targeted for life imprisonment because they spoke to the Bahrain Commission. They generally were targeted because they were a threat to the government. There were some consequences, some good consequences from the Bahrain Commission, although the government ignored the formal recommendations. During the process, during the few months that the inquiries were taking place, the government was sort of embarrassed here and there that, you know, the commission was like leaking bits and pieces of his report, and you've got like dozens of medical professionals in prison, tortured because they treated protesters. And this was sort of, you know, an easier, good case for the international press and the likes of us to latch onto because, you know, medics like sound respectable and not very terroristic. And so they were released, I think, a bit earlier than they would have been otherwise because of the protest, indirectly because there was a commission of inquiry that was sort of validating their stories. But I mean, the big missed opportunity there was that the recommendations were ignored. I mean, the recommendations, you know, range from the really fundamental structural of you need to completely redo how you are recruiting your police force, right through to all recommendations 1722G, that all interviews should be audio-visually recorded because people were clearly getting beaten up and tortured, abused in cells or in interrogation rooms, and just, you know, having a camera in there that defence lawyers can then access afterwards. That small stuff, none of that was implemented.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I'm on the board of Amnesty International, and so is someone else here, Jamie. And Amnesty made a submission to the Hong Kong government to set up an independent commission of inquiry, following basically the system that already is in place in Hong Kong for doing so, because there actually is an ordinance which has been mentioned, right, which can be used, and it has been, I think, generally effective as a system in Hong Kong. But as you may know, what the government in Hong Kong has said they would do is use the current model, which is the so-called Independent Police Complaints Council. Now, there are major problems with that because it doesn't have powers of investigation. It's not seen as independent in terms of the appointees and so on. And so this is sort of a related question, is do you have examples of countries which do have effective permanent commissions which obviously investigate police misconduct? Because that's a related issue in Hong Kong. Because I mean, I used to work in the UK, and when I was there, the UK one was not well respected when I was last there.
So I can't think of anywhere that really does it well. And in terms of, you know, a sort of a permanent oversight of the police. It's not everywhere is terrible, or that anywhere is perfect, right? There are bits and pieces of various systems which work. But for these one-off big deal inquiries, and I wonder here whether I'm not saying it won't, I just wonder here whether a commission of inquiry along the lines of previous commissions of inquiry here will do. I mean, I think it's a different incident here of what's happened over the last few months, and presumably which will carry on for some time yet, than an investigation into sanitation problems. Maybe you can have the same sort of structure. I don't know, but it seems to be much more emotional and raw. But I think there are one or two good other examples, right, in terms of having permanent oversight of policing, where you have civilian participation overseeing the conduct of police. On a very local level in the UK, I'll say something positive about the UK. I was until recently on in this programme scheme called independent custody visitors. It's like for do-gooders, right? You want to help the community. So what happens there's like a few dozen of us on the local, vetted as sensible people, who can be independent custody visitors, and it means that two of us, we go as a pair, every couple of weeks, can, any time we want, morning or night, turn up at a local police station, ring the bell, say we're independent custody visitors, and they have to, within seconds, march us straight into the detention cells. They can't keep us a few minutes, they can't cover anything up, they just got to march us straight in, and we go in and talk to the detainees. Have you been abused? Have you had a cup of tea? There's literally a quick list of questions. It's so British. Have you had a cup of tea? Have you been allowed to make a phone call? Is there any medication you need? And so I think that's a good local, cheap deterrent to abuse in custody. Now, it's not like it can't happen, right? And to get around that, the police are still clearly abusing teenagers and others on the street or in police vans on the way. But once you get to a police station in Britain, I think you're pretty safe these days. You're certainly much safer than we were, where there was no chance of some random check by someone in the community coming in and looking. But no, I don't think that. First of all, I don't know enough about everywhere in the world, but I don't think you can say Canada's got it right or Australia's got it right. But there are bits and pieces within systems. The problem with the UK and with the US is there are really far too many police forces. I mean, there's every city in the US has got its own little authority, and there are too many police divisions within the US, but within the UK also. So trying to get national standards implemented is really pretty difficult. I mean, it's just too atomised and there's too much local control. And so I can't remember if that was really what you asked. But
Could I ask a second question? Sure. I just want to follow up on that question. The purported reason of Carrie Lam is to say we've already have existing institutions, so we don't need an additional commission. But in those countries, under those circumstances, I would imagine that there were also existing institutions that would be able to look into those protests and police brutality, but that didn't prevent the government from saying, okay, we're open to this idea. We're going to set up an independent commission that has credibility, legitimacy, and the speed and the personnel to deal with this very exceptional circumstance. So I guess that's more a comment than a question. But if you know of any countries where they already have some institutions in place, but the government decided to implement a special commission because of special reasons, I would be really interested.
So I think all of them,
yeah.
not Bahrain, but the other three did. And in fact, in the case of the Bloody Sunday one, not only did they have the general oversight, they even had their own specific commission of inquiry to investigate what happened. And that was so crappy they had to do it again. So it's really about that level. The smell test is does the public trust this? If the public trusts that the internal police investigation is good enough, then you don't need an independent commission of inquiry. Right? But if you have an independent commission of inquiry, like the Wiggley report in 1972, and it's rubbish, then you're going to have to keep doing it until you get it right. The other point I'd make too, which I forgot to say, in the case of the Kerner Commission and the Savile inquiry, the Bloody Sunday inquiry, both of those held public hearings. And again, I'm not saying that this is better than not having public hearings. In the case of Scarman and the Basuna Commission, there weren't public hearings. They just had investigators go out and do a load of interviews, some of which then were made public afterwards. But again, I think it's just one of those things to weigh. Are you going to have truth finding only? Are you going to have a view to prosecutions? Are you going to have public hearings? The public hearings mean that they're going to be televised. Like what's going to work in terms of what the local community is going to accept as a fair, open, transparent process? The Kerner Commissions were not televised, but they were open to the public to come and visit. And we haven't spoken about South Africa because it's sort of a bit complicated. But the South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission at the end of apartheid, which wasn't about an afternoon or weeks or months or years of abuse, it was about generations, decades of abuse. Once the apartheid system fell there, then the Commission of Inquiry, national but sort of at a local level, had hundreds and hundreds of meetings locally where people were just encouraged to tell the truth. And basically that was enough. If you told the truth and you admitted and you confessed to what you'd done, if you were a police officer, then you more or less got immunity. But that doesn't really compare to the situation here.
Question over here.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for a really interesting presentation. I'm just wondering if you could say a bit more about one aspect of the Bahrain case. You mentioned that Bahrain was forced to have the commission due to international pressure. And so that's really interesting, right? Because obviously, there are lots of autocratic or degrees of autocratic countries where terrible things happen, and that's the end of it, right? So, and you keep, making the analogy with Hong Kong with the big scary power as the neighbour, right? So obviously, in the case of Bahrain, still for some reason pressure worked, and at least they had the commission. So, what were the mechanisms? Why did they bow to international pressure? Whereas in other situations it would probably be ignored.
Yeah, and in fact, those of us who were close to it at the time were fairly surprised, I think, that they did. They had come under a lot of pressure because in that short space of time, February, March, April, May, Amnesty had access to Bahrain, and so more or less did the international media. And so the trusted sources of information, international NGOs and the international media, were telling the truth. And the government really was sort of found it difficult to get, well, quite rightly, to get its side of the story across, because its side of the story really was not credible. But I think it's told itself an independent commission would sort of validate at least partially what it was saying. That, this was all unfair. It was like an international media conspiracy, and the Western international organisations were picking on it unfairly. And if you had something independent, then you'd get both sides of the story. So I think they thought that the commission would, in telling the truth, tell their side of the truth a bit better. There was also a lot of talk around the UN, the Human Rights Commissioner appointing an independent investigation, which I really think scared the bejesus out of them, that they thought that the UN was going to take control of a commission of inquiry. And so to preempt that, they thought that they ought to do one on their own, which was actually, looking back, at one of the criticisms that the likes of me and others had. Let the UN do it because you can't trust something that the king is going to pay for. Turns out actually it was pretty good. So the pressure on it was for its truth to be told, for the government's truth to be told, and if they didn't do it, then the UN might, and God knows the UN, they thought, are never going to be fair to it. So they, I mean, I don't say this with any sort of admiration, but certainly no respect, but they did play it super cleverly in that they just let the Commission tell the truth, very brutally, publicly, explicitly, and then just ignore it. And again, I think, you know, part of the criticism I would have of the commissioners, Bastiani died in the last couple of years actually, but and so did Nigel Rodley, but part of the criticism I've had of the commissioners is that they went pretty quiet after that too. I think they should have said, you know, 3 years later, hang on a minute, well, we said all this stuff and you ignored it. They didn't really want it to get into the politics of how their report had been ignored.
Can I just follow up on the theme of some of the earlier questions? From memory, the Hong Kong ombuds system was set up, excluding the police, and calls were made subsequently for the police to be brought into the fold. Now that's not necessarily an answer to put it under the ombuds, because that only deals with maladministration. But be that as it may, they've always been excluded from the ombuds service. And from recollection, it's always been a difficult issue to look at the question of investigation, because any independent body outside the police system with the right to inquire the conduct of the police will need to have hands and legs. And so I'd like to hear from you what other systems, how other systems deal with this, because you would need operators, you would need investigators to investigate the police. And that's one of the reasons why we had to take the investigation of corruption out from the police and set up a separate institution for it, because you cannot have police investigating itself. And so, you know, if you've got any advice on what other people do to get around that very practical problem, how do we
Here's a result from the web.
So,
that's an answer. Siri's going to tell you.
Someone's listening. The other thing that I have in mind, and that's been at the back of my head for the longest time, in other jurisdictions, who calls the shot on what is labeled a riot? Should it be exclusively police province, or what is the protocol that people set up to deal with that kind of issue? I mean, Donald Trump cannot just press the button for nuclear warfare. So there should be protocols set up somewhere. And you know, I don't know if you can offer any advice or information on what other people do on these very practical things.
So on the second one first, on the what's a riot and what isn't, you know, the first thing, there are like legal definitions of what a riot is and what not, you know, and British laws have like the Riot Act and.
What do they do? I mean, do the police say that that's a riot?
The police, in Victorian times, would declare, stand up in front of the crowd and read the Riot Act. I don't know if people are like sort of in common phrasing the language, right? You read the Riot Act means we're about to go berserk here, right? But here's your warning. Here's the police reading the Riot Act, which says riots are illegal. This is one of them. You better run away, right? So. The police have that authority, certainly in Britain, to declare what's a riot and what's not. But then the other thing which the Kerner Commission did look at pretty closely is what definition the press uses too, which I think is interesting. So I don't know whether there are, if anyone here is a journalist, and or if the local press here has guidelines for reporters to describe a disturbance as a protest or a riot, and whether or not that's identical to whatever police definition there is.
My guess is not. But what happened here this time was the Commissioner of Police saying, I now characterize this as a riot.
Right.
And that was it. Of course, you can challenge that in court later on when you're charged with behavior related to a riot. But I'm just concerned with who is a person that should be declaring that status, and whether or not that person has sufficient guidelines on what should be a riot, simply from the enforcement point of view, not from the court's point of view.
Well, I don't, when I can think of examples, I don't think that the problem is necessarily that they don't have guidelines, it's that they don't necessarily apply them properly. But usually it's like, in practical terms, I mean, you know how you have to make a quick decision, right? The senior police officer has to decide whether or not it's going to declare it a riot and therefore give itself permission to take actions accordingly. But how it's reported then, I mean, this matters more and more nowadays that you have real-time news. You know, in the old days it was what happened the night before, was that reported as a riot or not? But now it's, you know, what's happening 3 seconds ago, is that a riot or not? And so when you say you don't think that's true, did you mean you don't?
I mean, I was referring to the reporters.
Yeah,
I don't think there's a handbook that spells out when and how a reporter should describe something.
So there might be, because there are in other jurisdictions, and you have a lot of international media here too. I don't know if the local report from Bloomberg here
if, for instance, you have a New York Times or a Tribune handbook, that's quite possible. But generally, I don't think there is one.
I don't know. I think it'd be useful to find out. I was interested today, you know, the case of
the press does not have the power to go and throw tear gas at someone. So my concern is with the police, because the press, for good reporting, they should have a clear guideline and avoid allegations of fake news, double.
No, I agree
with that. But the police, I don't know if they have guidelines on what should be properly called a riot and what not. And having characterized it as a riot, it seemed to me that it's been extended from that day on until now. You know, so I'm just curious about what other people do when they need to use that term in the police force and by the police.
Well, I'd be surprised if the local police don't have guidelines, whether or not they're adhering to them faithfully or not is something else. But I'd be surprised if they don't have guidelines to guide them in declaring we are now in a riot situation. I mean, maybe they don't, but I mean, it's a British-based system, and the British police do.
Well, what do the British police do?
So then,
what do they have to go through?
Right.
So something
I mean, you know, the decisions are made fast, but if it looks like there is an unlawful gathering and assembly that is turning violent, you know, if there's looting or there's attacks on the police and if there's sufficient size, then the police can. But it's a pretty high threshold, really. To it's not 6 people smashing in the windows of a local McDonald's. That's not a riot, right? It's got to be bigger than that. But local British police and Irish police do have those guidelines. The reporting here, I think, is interesting. I saw. I'm not making a criticism at all here. I'm just saying that somebody had to judge at the South China Morning Post how to headline the story about the student who has been injured from the fall in the car park. And I saw the headline today was that they reported that as an accident, right? Now, I'm not saying it was or it wasn't, but there's a judgment there in the newsroom that they have to make to characterise and report responsibly on that too. Let alone, you know, did that happen in the context of a riot or not? Is it an accident? Is it something more sinister than an accident?
What about investigation of the police? I mean, who would be investigating them in terms of really detective work?
So, I think that this talks to your point a bit. Sort of in the normal communal garden, who polices the police, right? You have like oversight bodies made up of usually civilian oversight bodies, like independent police commissioners in the UK, for instance. But there are then, clearly we're talking about here, incidents which are too big for that body. I mean, ad hoc, different special commissions for inquiry have to be set up, as they are for, you know, international war tribunals, right, or international criminal court tribunals. So in terms of everyday police corruption, or even something a bit more serious than that, it usually doesn't require an independent commission of inquiry unless something is of a huge scale or is so controversial as it was in Britain in the murder of Stephen Lawrence, which was like only the murder of one guy, but it was so badly handled and revealed and exposed so much about police incompetence that a whole different commission of inquiry then had to be specially set up for it.
Yeah. I mean, forgive me for pursuing this, but in Britain, it's such a larger area. So you could bring in a police force from another part of UK.
Yeah.
But this place is so small.
Right.
I mean, you know, it's not useful to bring in a policeman from one tribe to investigate something for the central station.
Well, I have to say the police record in Britain in investigating itself, even across different police forces, isn't that great. You know, as I say, I think there are too many police forces in Britain, right? Too many different fairly autonomous jurisdictions. And occasionally, a force from the Somerset and Avon police is brought in to investigate notoriously corrupt long-term criminal police, the West Midlands police, which is Birmingham, right? And basically they rarely do a good job. They rarely do a good job. I don't think that really has public trust. And so in this case, you may be looking at bringing in, I'm not advocating this, but if the police here can't be trusted to investigate themselves on a day-to-day basis of corruption murders, maybe you're looking at some international thing.
Corruption is siphoned off, but it's a non-corruption. Things like abuse, disproportionate use of force.
Thanks for your presentation. So I've been surprised in Hong Kong how extremes on both sides are calling for a commission of inquiry, both on the pro-democracy and the pro-establishment side. I think they're thinking that they can control who the commissioners are. I don't study domestic commissions of inquiry. I study international commissions of inquiry. I've actually been involved in them, and I think they're success. I don't know how you classify these. My sense is that you would see them as failures. I think on the international level, we have a really long track record of success with commissions of inquiry, dating back to 1905 all the way until recent times. And they've been successful because they focus on determining facts and they don't interpret those facts. And so I guess I've been in the awkward position of being asked, well, should we have a commission of inquiry? And I'm like, what are we hoping it will do? If we want it to determine facts, yes, commissions can be quite successful, especially if you can get neutral commissioners, or have two commissioners on one side, two commissioners on another, and then one who's neutral, or something like that, so you actually have a balance. You're not aiming for everyone being neutral or whatever. And then you're making a really small goal, right, based on facts and determining what the facts are. If you're trying to just kick the problem to a commission that's sort of outside, it's not really going to be a solution, is my perspective. And again, I haven't focused on the domestic commissions of inquiry, but from the international perspective, there is potential here with commissions of inquiry, and you can look at the Permanent Court of Arbitration that has rules on commissions of inquiry and has a track record of success. Yes, they've been mostly between states, but their constitution doesn't limit them to handling just interstate commissions of inquiry. So I think that's probably the solution. I think we need to have hard think about what we want it to do, and if we can limit it just to determining facts, we have a shot. If we're wanting them to interpret those facts to make some legal determination, I think there's no chance this is going to resolve really anything. I'm wondering if you have any opinion on that.
I do. First of all, I didn't really mean to give the impression that I thought all of these were failures. I mean, I think they all failed to some degree, but I think they were all also valuable to some extent. I think there's some good came out of all of them. Even, say with the Bahrain one, there certainly was a sense of overall, I guess, of letdown or betrayal, really, of being sold out. But even then, it really did tell the truth. And for a lot of people in Bahrain who had been either jailed or tortured, this wasn't total satisfaction, of course, in that the perpetrators were never prosecuted. But at least there was a satisfaction that the official version of what happened was their truth. And even with Kerner too, where the recommendations were not implemented in the following year or two by the government, which would have been ideal, it was such a thorough investigation, and the template was made, you know, a lot of sense in terms of the recommendation that over the following decades, police forces or advisors went back to look at, oh yeah, this is a good idea. You know, what I recruit this way and have community policing or whatever. So I think there was something valuable in each of those. And then, sorry, the second part of what you said, I was just going to...
I ran I apologize.
No.
I can't even.
There was something I really wanted to get my teeth in. I can't remember what it was.
International Commissions
Oh, yeah.
Permanent Court of Arbitration.
Yeah. So if you define the usefulness or the success of an independent commission by it finds the truth, it makes recommendations, and they're implemented, that's a perfectly sensible, good way to define its success, right? But I think also in the case of each of these, there was a sort of a valuable byproduct, if you like, that just the existence of a commission of inquiry calmed things down a little bit. So in April of 81, the inquiry into the riots over that weekend were announced like on the Monday and Tuesday or something. And I'm not saying because of that none of us went out on the following weekend looking for trouble again, but there was, just by the announcement that something was going to happen and it was being taken seriously and we're going to listen to what you said, that in itself was valuable and brought a certain, not exactly calm, but I think de-electrified the tension there a bit. So, you know, if a commission inquiry is announced here, which sort of passes or at least begins to meet the test of public trust. Now, whatever happens eventually in terms of, you know, what it finds and what it recommends and what's implemented, that's the stuff that I suppose is most important. But even its existence and that it's going to be going out and listening to people and vindicating their stories, even that is useful. Do you see what I mean?
But can I just say that I think in Hong Kong, public doesn't want just the talk about the facts. They do want justice, because there are so many incidents going on in Hong Kong where clearly the police are abusing their powers. And I mean, one of the key recommendations has to be, which relates to what we're raising, is that there isn't an independent body to investigate the police in Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. The IPCC is not independent, and the UN's been saying that about Hong Kong for decades. So even just that, as a recommendation in itself, is it would be a huge, important change in Hong Kong. So I don't think the people would be satisfied at all if it just says, oh yes, we admit there were mistakes made, but so what? What does that? That doesn't change anything then.
I don't know. I mean, really, I don't know, and
I just mean, based on my understanding of people, the public in Hong Kong now.
You probably have a big debate on terms of reference.
Yeah, they want more than just facts. They want justice to be done.
And then within that, then there's a huge range, right? So do you want? I mean, what we're getting out of Bloody Sunday all these years later is one very junior, because you know he was so young at the time he's still alive, Soldier F, being prosecuted, right? The guys that gave the orders who were that much older are now dead, and they've escaped, right? So if you're looking then at what would be a satisfying level, if you like, of prosecution, supposing we roll this on now to, you know, ideally you get a commission of inquiry, finds the truth, identifies individual police officers who are responsible, then how far up the chain is that going to have to go for people to be satisfied? What are they going to be charged with? How long are they really going to spend in prison? And I'm not suggesting there's a morally right or wrong way to do this, but really what happens is politically, what do you need to do for people to be satisfied? I mean, at the end of the Northern Ireland peace deal in 1998, you know, Northern Ireland then escalated partly because of what happened in Bloody Sunday, and you know, the army was seen to be completely out of control and violent. This was the end for many people's trust in non-violent protest, right? that evening of Bloody Sunday and the following week, the IRA, the armed paramilitary force, was just inundated with recruits. I'm never going on a peaceful march again because what happens, we just get shot, give me a gun, right? So then you went into 30 years, 25 years of violent insurrection. And at the end of that, the peace deal, which was voted on by the public and overwhelmingly passed, included the clause which was, it doesn't matter what you've been convicted of, mass murder, terrorism, whatever it was you've done, if you have served 2 years in prison, you can go free, right? And the public voted for that, and that was very difficult for some of the families of the victims to see that, you know, this person had been murdered and the perpetrator had been identified properly, tried and found guilty, and was released after 2 years. But politically they had to swallow that, and they did, and it sort of worked again. I mean, we're back sort of again in Northern Ireland to a one country, two system thing, which is sort of holding out for another generation. I don't know if it will long term, but it sort of is. But even within there, do you want convictions? Then there's a whole other range of questions there. Of who, how many, is it going to, how far up the line does it go? And if you do convict them, you know, are you going to, when you see in other places, you're really going to convict them with long sentences, but then when everyone calms down in 2 or 3 years, you're going to, you know, find an excuse to pardon them, or... I think it's less of a legal question than politically what people are prepared to accept.
Thank you.
All right.
I think that was actually perfectly on time. If there's no other questions, but I did not leave enough time for you to discuss a final question of conflicts within social movements. So if you have a few minutes that you want to comment on it,
really
otherwise you have to come back again.
No, well, that's fine. So when I was here a month ago and I was talking to protesters, to young protesters, several of them asked me what my experience of observing conflict within political or protest or human rights movements was. And for anyone that's interested, I just want to say it's perfectly normal. In fact, I've never seen or been part of a human rights movement or studied a human rights movement which didn't have pretty bitter personal ego problems, even hatred within movements, whether it's the anti-apartheid movement, which was like super successful. It ended that terrible racist system of apartheid in South Africa that had existed for generations. Even the good guys within that, right? I mean, some of us just hated each other, and we just got over it and got on with it. In the American Civil Rights Movement, again, you know, a success story from history, right? The players within that, not least at the very top, Martin Luther King treated Rosa Parks despicably, and she really was bitter about how that relationship was. That's just all perfectly normal. I don't think it's a good thing. I wouldn't encourage internal splits and friction within a protest movement, but it doesn't necessarily destroy it. The more recent movements I've been close to in Bahrain or Egypt or wherever, you know, there's a lot of infighting and backstabbing and jealousy and some really unpleasant stuff that goes on within the good guys. And again, I'm not advocating for that. I'm not saying you ought to have it, but it doesn't destroy the movement. I was going to make some cultural references as examples, and I realised they're all like 50 years too old, right? But like the Beatles, in the last 2 years of their existence, produced some of their best stuff and just hated each other, right? 5 years later, 10 years later, Fleetwood Mac, an American rock band, produced the best-selling album of all time, up until then, called Rumours. Not only while they hated each other, but the album is about how much they hate each other. Manchester United, been going for 120 years, its most successful team ever in 1999, won, which no other team before has ever won, the FA Cup, the Premier League, and the Champions League. Its two-star forwards, Teddy Sheringham and Andy Cole, could not bear to talk to each other off the pitch. ABBA, the Beach Boys, for those of you interested in early Christianity, St. Peter and St. Paul, absolutely on a personal level detested each other. But it didn't mean that what they were trying to create, whether it was an international religious movement or a rock group, or a sports team, or a protest movement is necessarily going to be destroyed by that. That was, I mean, I have a longer version of that, but that's essentially that, right?
I'm going to leave that for the summing up of today. Thank you guys all for coming, and thanks for your engaging questions. Thank you, Brian.
Bye, Lindsay. Please wishes from Sarah.